You've got 2 bike rides to do this week. The first one is you've got to ride to the shops, and the second one is you've got to ride to the top of a mountain. How likely is it that you're going to fall off of your bike riding to the shops buying a packet of biscuits? Pretty unlikely, if I assume you know how to ride a bike and the roads are pretty flat and there aren't many potholes, which might not be true in most parts of the UK at the moment. If you fell off your bike, what's the worst that would happen? Well, you might scrape your knee, you might sprain your wrist, perhaps you'd scratch your bike, maybe even squash the biscuits. How likely would it be that you would fall off your bike if you had to cycle it to the top of the nearest mountain? My guess is it would be much more likely, as there aren't any roads, there's going to be loose rocks and pebbles, there's going to be tree roots, it might be raining, and there's always the potential that you'll get chased by a mountain lion. What would happen if you fell off of the bike while riding up a mountain? More than just a scraped knee. You'd probably break a bone, you might crack the frame on your bike, you might buckle your wheels, you would definitely squash your biscuits, and you might even end up getting eaten by the mountain lion. Given those 2 scenarios, which one would you spend more time and effort preparing for? Not all risks are created equal, and we need a way to assess risks to find out whether they should be treated, and if they should, how quickly they should be treated. In this episode, we're going to talk about risk assessment, which is just a fancy way of understanding the likelihood of a risk happening and the impact of a risk happening, which is what would happen if it were to happen. My name is Mike Pearce, and this is my series on information security. Every week I'll be bringing you some simple ideas and some not so simple but pretty important ones anyway on how best to protect your business from cyber criminals who would use your data and your valuable assets for their own nefarious ends. You should care about this InfoSec stuff because at its heart, information security is about keeping your business safe and helping you achieve your primary business goals. If you like this video, please hit the like button, and if you really liked it, hit the subscribe button so we can get the word out there and make the internet a safer place for everybody. If you've watched my previous videos on creating an asset list and then discovering the risk to those assets, both of which will be linked above, then you should have a good sized risk log which contains your assets and the threats and vulnerabilities and the consequences of those threats and vulnerabilities happening to those assets. If you haven't, don't worry, we'll use the examples that we used in the previous episode, so if you're watching along, you'll understand where we are. When you think about a risk, in the back of your head, there's some unconscious thought going on that helps you know how likely that risk is to happen. In order to properly understand a risk and know whether or not to do anything about it, we need to be able to quantify how likely that risk is. Now, there's a bunch of methods on understanding how likely a risk is to happen. Some of them are more time consuming than others, but I'll give you a quick run through of them now. There's historical data analysis. If you've had similar events happen in the past, or you have access to data about similar events happening in the past, you can understand how likely things are to happen. For example, if a particular type of equipment has failed 10 times out of 1,000 uses, then we know that the failure rate for that particular piece of equipment is 1%. There are statistical methods you can use for understanding likelihood. You can use statistical models such as probability distributions, regression analysis, or even Bayesian influence might be used. These models can help estimate the likelihood of an event happening based on a range of variables and data points, but this is quite time consuming and probably not appropriate for a startup or a small business. Expert judgment is another method. If you don't have historical data, you can use an expert on the thing that the risk is about and see what they think. Most risk likelihood assessments use a scoring system like low, medium or high, or 1 through 5. I don't really like using this method because it's difficult to know what the difference is between a 2 and a 3 or a 3 and a 4 without any kind of objective measurement to help you. You can use simulations and modeling, so you can build computer simulations or computer models to be able to play through the risk hundreds or even thousands of times and see what happens. Again, this is pretty time consuming and you probably need to have specific software or expertise or experts to help you with that. Again, not something I'd use in a startup or a small business. Finally, you could use gut feel. We're all professionals. We all have some understanding of how our business works. We've got people working for us, technology people, finance people. So you could wave your finger in the air and take a guess at it, and you'd probably be close enough to make it useful to be able to assess a risk properly. But my advice in this context is to use a combination of historical data, expert advice, and a little bit of finger waving. But the outcome will be a scoring system that helps you understand how bad your risks are compared to each other and to be able to rank them. My preferred method of scoring risks, which I use all the time and you might want to start with until you've got good at this and you can start using some of the other methods, is like this. So I'm talking about likelihood. There are 6 levels of likeliness. that a risk might come true. The first is it's unlikely to happen. The chance of this thing happening is pretty much close to zero. There's never a chance that it will never happen, but it's very, very unlikely to happen. The next one is likely and later. So it's likely to happen, but if it does, it will be after 3 months. The next one is likely and soon. So it is, again, it's likely to happen, but it will happen within 3 months. After that, we've got definite and soon, definite and later. So definite and soon is, it's definitely going to happen, and it's going to happen within the next 3 months. And definite and later is it's definitely going to happen, but after 3 months. And the final likelihood assessment is it's happening. It's happening right now. So this kind of assessment gives you a lot more information than just scoring it 1 through 5 or low, medium, high. It tells you how likely it is to happen and when it might happen. Some things are almost certain to occur, like a data breach due to human error or a key person leaving the organization. And so you can use these likely soon and likely later levels of likelihood assessment to understand that. But things like laptops being stolen through burglars tailgating staff into your office are much less likely to happen, to the point of being completely rare, if you've got some decent security in your office space or in your shared office space. By now, you've got your risk description based on your assets, your threats, your vulnerabilities, and now you've got a likelihood of how likely that risk is to happen. But what happens to your organization if that risk does come true? And this is where we start talking about the impact of a risk occurring. Impact refers to the potential consequences that might happen should a risk or event ever occur. It measures the severity or significance on an event's outcome on an organization, system, individual, or environment. Typically, impact is measured with a couple of different categories. The first is financial cost, which are direct costs such as replacing laptops or other hardware, and then there are indirect costs such as loss of revenue or paying insurance fees or premiums and that kind of stuff. Then there's operational cost, which are things like downtime to your systems or services, or the loss of resources in order to fix the problems that the risk has caused. Another category is reputational impact, so the impact on your NPS or your CSAT scores or your kind of social media sentiment should a risk occur. And finally, there are legal and regulatory consequences that could have fines or other penalties associated with them. Depending on the type of organization you work for, it could also include health and safety, which considers harm to people, and the environment, which considers harm to the natural world. My preferred way of doing an impact assessment for small businesses and startups will combine financial and operational impact. So that's the money that you have to spend to fix a thing, or the money that you lose to fix a thing, and the amount of time it takes to fix it using the resources you have, which are your people. So on this table, you can see we've got the impact, the time to fix, and the cost to the business per month. Now, your mileage may vary with this. These are ones that I use kind of as standard in my training, and some small businesses use it, but you might have other ideas. Maybe things take much longer to fix at your organization, or they take much less time to fix. Maybe things cost more or less per month. So if one of your risks were to happen, and the cost of the business might be in the hundreds of thousands and not in the tens of thousands. So it's worth modifying this to suit your own scale and size. To be clear, you can use this table as an either or. So for example, something might take 1 to 2 days to fix, and it will also cost the business less than £5,000 a month. Additionally, you could say it will cost 1 to 2 days to fix, or it will cost £5,000 per month, or it might take 1 to 2 days to fix, but it will cost £25,000 per month in lost revenue, for example. Pick the worst case scenario. So if it takes 1 to 2 days to fix, but it will cost the business £50,000 or more a month, then select the £50,000 more a month, which is the really high bracket. This means the scoring of risks will be consistent, and it kind of gives the risk the gravity it needs to be taken seriously. If people think, it only takes a couple of days to fix, then maybe they won't look at it so closely. But if it takes a couple of days to fix and costs them £50,000 a month, they might take it more seriously. So at this point, run through your risk register, set your impact for every single risk. So by now you should have your likelihood set and your impact set. Now you've got your risk description, the likelihood of it happening, and the impact to the business if it does happen. The combination of this likelihood and the impact is known as the risk, which is a little confusing, so let's call it the risk score. The simplest way to understand the risk score for each of your risks is to assign a number to each of your likelihood and your impact assessments, and then times one by the other, and whatever is spat out at the end is your risk score. So for example, if we were to say unlikely to happen is 1 and happening right now is 6, and on the impact side, low is 1 and really high is 4, then it gives us some really simple numbers to work with to understand the risk scores. So if you're using a spreadsheet, there's a pretty simple formula for this. I won't tell you how to do it. If you've got this far, you probably know how to do that, but it will give you your risk score for all of your risks. So as you can see in our risk register here, we've applied this scoring to each of the risks, and we understand which are big and which are small. But what do we do with these scores? My risk register is really short because it's just a few example risks, but your risk register may be really long. You might have tens of assets and potentially tens or even hundreds of risks. And so working on all of those risks is just not feasible. It's going to be completely overwhelming. So we use this risk score and what we call a threshold to understand which are the risks that you need to work on the most. Now, there's a number of ways of understanding what your risk threshold is. And broadly speaking, you would look at what your company objectives are. You'd look at what resource you have available and what capacity for that resource you have available for mitigating these risks, or having historical data for risks and past experiences. Then you can quantify your risk tolerance threshold. So if you're a startup or a small business, this process can be pretty onerous. And if you just want to get started with your risks, then there's a slightly simpler, bit more finger-wavy method to understand your risk threshold. I'm not saying you shouldn't do the onerous process. You definitely should, if you have the time, the capacity, and the resource to do it. But there is a gut feel, back of the napkin way that you can do this to get you started and to get you working on your risk mitigations. So first of all, order your risk log by the risk score. Now you can see, looking at your risks in your risk log, the risks that you really need to work on are at the top, and you should work on them in that kind of order if appropriate. But where do you stop? Like, how far down that list do you go? So for each one of these risks, start to add some ideas on how you might mitigate them. You don't need a kind of fully planned out mitigation. Just a couple of sentences and a couple of ideas of how you might mitigate it is enough. As you work down the list, you'll come to a risk where if you add the mitigations, it doesn't seem to pay off. It's like that mitigation seems like quite a lot of work for that risk. That risk doesn't seem that much effort. When you get to that point, that's your risk threshold. Whatever that risk score is, everything below that, you don't want to worry about. These aren't risks that you should ignore forever, though. They just get put onto the back burner. In any kind of risk management framework, you want to go back to these risks at some point in the future, maybe in 6 months, maybe in 12 months, whatever cadence is appropriate to you, and check that the impact and the likelihood remain the same. If they do, you can continue just to leave them on the archive. But if the impact or likelihood have changed, if your business has changed or your people have changed, then you might want to, at that point, reassess them. Maybe they get a higher risk score, and then you're going to need to look at them. If you've got this far through the series, you should have an asset list, or an asset register, a risk register with some really decent risks written out. And thanks to this video, you now understand the likelihood and the impact of those risks coming true and their score. And you may even have some decent mitigations or some ideas for mitigations to get you started on solving those risks. In the next video, we're going to briefly talk about mitigation strategies. So categories of things that you can do to mitigate those risks, and then we'll also start looking at some of the mitigations themselves. The mitigations will be based on the Annex A controls of ISO 27001, but don't worry, they're much simpler than they seem and can be reasonably applied in any organization of any size. So thanks for watching. If you like this video, hit the like button. If you really liked it, hit the subscribe button, share it with your friends. Let's get the word out there, and hopefully together we can make the internet a much safer place. Until next time, stay safe. Beam me up, Scotty.